Prime Minister Mark Carney touched down in Armenia for a 3-day official stay from May 2nd to May 4th. Yet the window for direct, high-level discussions with Armenian officials barely stretched beyond 20 hours. That brief period came just 20 hours before the opening of the 8th European Political Community Summit, which drew nearly 50 leaders from around the world to Yerevan. At first glance, 20 hours might seem insignificant, a routine visit, a quick handshake, and some ceremonial photographs. But that interpretation overlooks the deeper currents at play. What is happening in Yerevan is far from ceremonial. It represents the outward expression of a prolonged, subtle strategic maneuver. Canada has been methodically carving out influence in the South Caucasus, constructing its presence one deliberate step at a time over several years. To appreciate the stakes, it is essential to examine the fundamentals. Armenia is a compact, landlocked, mountainous nation, positioned at the junction of 4 of the globe's most consequential neighbors. To the west lies Turkey, a NATO member carrying deep historical grievances toward Yerevan and maintaining close military cooperation with Baku. Iran borders it to the south, while Russia and Azerbaijan lie to the north and east. Every policy choice in Yerevan sends ripples through pipeline networks, military alliances, and global strategic calculations, far exceeding what the country's modest size would suggest. For the majority of the post-Soviet era, Armenia's foreign orientation revolved almost exclusively around Moscow. The country hosted Russian military bases, relied heavily on Russian natural gas, and operated under the security umbrella of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the Russian-led alliance intended as a counterbalance to NATO in the former Soviet space. Yerevan's alignment was not merely cooperative, it was widely regarded as Russia's most dependable client in the Caucasus. This arrangement collapsed with striking clarity in 2020. Azerbaijan launched a military campaign to reclaim Nagorno-Karabakh, the disputed enclave that had been under Armenian control since the early 1990s. Armenia called on Moscow for support. Moscow, however, did not respond. The conflict lasted 44 days, ending with Armenia's defeat. In September 2023, Azerbaijan executed a rapid operation lasting fewer than 24 hours, resulting in the complete evacuation of the enclave. Roughly 120,000 ethnic Armenians fled in mere days. Russian forces, stationed as peacekeepers under the 2020 ceasefire agreement, watched but did not intervene in any meaningful way. The patron state had not failed in principle, it had simply stood by. Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, who assumed office following a popular uprising in 2018, began systematically reducing Armenia's dependency on Moscow. The country pulled out of CSTO exercises, initiated open discussions about European integration, and allowed an EU civilian monitoring mission to operate along the volatile border with Azerbaijan. In a region where even minimal westward movement historically triggers intense Russian scrutiny, these steps were far from symbolic. Canada recognized and acted upon this opening. Its presence in Armenia has expanded in ways unimaginable a decade ago. In 2018, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau became the first Canadian leader to visit Armenia, attending the Francophonie Summit in Yerevan. By 2023, Canada had established a full-fledged embassy in the capital. Yet the move that arguably deserved far greater international attention was Canada's participation in the EU mission in Armenia, the first non-European Union country to join. Canadian personnel were deployed physically along the Armenian-Azerbaijani border, one of the most fragile and contested frontiers in Eurasia. This is not mere diplomatic pageantry, it is strategic positioning achieved over years, carrying tangible consequences for regional security and influence. Christopher Waters, an international law professor at the University of Windsor, underscores that Armenia's geography and recent trajectory make it a nation of significant and rising importance for Ottawa. The country's recalibration of alliances, coupled with Canada's strategic embedding, signals a reshaping of influence in the South Caucasus that will resonate well beyond Yerevan's borders. He highlighted that the conditions in Armenia are ripe for expanding cooperation across education, economic development, and security sectors. The country is portrayed as a democratic state navigating an extremely complex neighborhood, consciously choosing to pivot toward the west. Its territory sits astride critical energy corridors, channeling Caspian oil and gas toward European markets. Alongside this, Armenia shares a border with Iran and lies directly within the operational spheres of both Turkish and Russian military power. In a region like this, no piece of land is strategically insignificant. Canada's involvement, however, has faced its share of complications, and full transparency demands acknowledging these challenges. During the 2020 war, optical sighting components manufactured by L3 Harris Westcam, headquartered in Burlington, Ontario, were integrated into Turkish-made Barakar drones. Azerbaijan deployed these drones with devastating effect against Armenian forces. Canada responded by suspending the associated export permits in October 2020. A subsequent government review confirmed credible evidence that the components were used contrary to their export approval, leading Ottawa to formally revoke the permits in 2021. The export freeze persisted until early 2024, lifted only after Turkey ratified Sweden's accession to NATO. The timing of this decision is crucial. The resumption of exports was explicitly tied to Turkey fulfilling a NATO commitment. Armenian analysts interpreted the move as transactional, leaving a lingering sense of mistrust. Canada's government has since sought to rebuild confidence through sustained diplomatic dialogue. Another notable issue involves Brat Gilstanian, an Armenian Apostolic Church archbishop holding dual Canadian-Armenian citizenship. In 2024, he rose to prominence as a leader of the opposition movement known as the Holy Struggle, publicly expressing readiness to replace Prime Minister Pashinyan. Legally, his Canadian citizenship rendered him ineligible for the office under Armenian law. In June 2025, Armenian authorities arrested Gilstanian along with over a dozen associates on charges of attempting to seize power. Global affairs. Canada confirmed that it maintained contact with local authorities, but cited privacy concerns in withholding further details. The situation underscores Canada's direct citizen-level stake in Armenia's domestic political landscape, a matter that remains active and unresolved. These incidents do not nullify the strategic rationale behind Canada's engagement. They introduce complexity and demand accountability beyond formal statements, but they do not alter the fundamental stakes. Alan Whitehorn, Professor Emeritus at the Royal Military College of Canada in Kingston, emphasized the potential for Armenian military educational institutions to gain substantially from deeper collaboration with Canadian counterparts. He pointed to Canada's senior military colleges as exemplary models for Armenia's ongoing institutional modernization, as the country seeks to distance its armed forces from Russian doctrinal frameworks. Armenia already participates in NATO's Defense Education Enhancement Program, with Canada contributing to these efforts. Whitehorn argues that the logical progression is establishing a direct bilateral defense education partnership. Military education shapes doctrine. Doctrine determines how armies operate, plan, and most critically, how they perceive allies and adversaries. Should Canada become a principal partner in the reconstruction of Armenia's military institutions away from Russian standards, it would embed Canadian influence into the long-term organizational culture of the Armenian armed forces. This influence extends across generations of officers, not merely over a single fiscal period. Rob Hubert from the University of Calgary offered insight that clarifies the broader significance of Carney's presence at the European Political Community Summit. Hubert observed that the very act of Armenia hosting the gathering conveys a potent message to Moscow. For years, Vladimir Putin has constructed a narrative portraying Western engagement near Russia's borders as a direct threat, one that warrants a strategic response. Armenia's hosting of this summit, coupled with Canada's active involvement, punctuates the shifting geopolitical dynamics in the region and signals the growing reach of Western influence on Moscow's periphery. The European Political Community Summit convened in Yerevan with Canadian involvement, taking place just beyond the mountain ranges from Russian territory. Rob Hubert's interpretation is unambiguous. The West is signaling, through its very presence rather than formal declarations, that it is prepared to engage with any nation pursuing ties with the West, regardless of where Moscow would prefer influence to dominate. The notable exclusion of Russia from the EPC framework communicates the summit's most significant message, a message amplified by Canada's active participation. Zooming out, a clear pattern emerges. Canada has consistently demonstrated, more through action than rhetoric, its aspiration to act as a connective middle power. It is not a nation whose foreign policy halts at the Atlantic or defaults to Washington's agenda. Instead, Canada is asserting itself as a country capable of sustained engagement across multiple regions, linking North American capacities with European institutional structures in areas previously resistant to Western influence. Armenia is one pivotal node in this expanding network. The Arctic, where Canada is extending its military posture in response to Russian and Chinese maneuvers, represents another. The Indo-Pacific constitutes a third. These are not isolated initiatives. They reflect a coherent vision about Canada's intended role as the global order reshapes itself. The underlying argument is clear. Canada is not merely a regional power with polite international aspirations. It is a competent middle power asserting operational reach across diverse theaters, determined to deploy that reach deliberately. Ottawa has consistently advocated for the release of Armenian political detainees held by Azerbaijan, a stance upheld under both the Trudeau and Carney administrations. Christopher Waters notes that principled advocacy, when coupled with tangible on-the-ground engagement rather than mere statements, strengthens Canada's credibility as an honest broker, a nation capable of exerting pressure where larger powers hesitate or cannot act without risking uncontrollable escalation. So, what does Carney achieve in just 20 hours in Yerevan? He meets with Prime Minister Pashinyan, signaling continuity of top-level commitment. He attends the EPC summit as the only non-European leader ever formally invited. reinforcing Canada's evolution from an Atlantic partner to an indispensable contributor to European security architecture. Standing in a capital that lies between Iran, Russia, Turkey, and Azerbaijan, Carney allows the visual narrative to speak volumes even before a single official communiqué is issued. There is no dramatic military announcement, no immediate deployment of Canadian forces. High-level diplomacy rarely generates instant headlines. Instead, it accumulates, layering facts on the ground that future administrations inherit as baseline realities rather than discretionary choices. What unfolds in Yerevan in the early days of May 2026 represents the culmination of a decade of intentional Canadian decisions. Each choice is defensible in isolation, yet together they form a strategic posture that would have seemed improbable when Trudeau first arrived in the city 8 years ago. The actor Moscow should scrutinize most closely in the Caucasus is not an EU state, nor a NATO ally with stationed troops. It is a North American middle power that established an embassy 3 years ago, joined a border monitoring mission, and has now dispatched its prime minister to a summit no leader outside Europe had previously accessed. Moscow does not require explicit mentions in Carney's statements to grasp the implications. The summit's guest list conveys it clearly. The absent nation knows exactly what each attending country's presence signifies. 20 hours may seem brief, yet it represents a runway constructed over years of careful planning. And the trajectory extends far beyond Yerevan, signaling Canada's long-term operational intentions in global theaters, and solidifying its role as a deliberate, capable middle power, shaping the rules of engagement in key geopolitical landscapes.